Welcome back, Endgame community. I'm Chris, and I'm here to bring you some of my favorite sneaky starts for Week 11. And let's start with running back. How about Salvon Ahmed of the Dolphins? No, not a guy you're generally starting in your lineup, but there's reason to think he could have some good flex appeal here in Week 11, namely because he's going up against the New York Jets. The Jets have allowed 13 running backs to score at least 15 PPR points in 9 games. Do the math. 13 running backs, 9 games. That's more than one running back per game. And since Malcolm Brown has been out, it's been only Myles Gaskin and Salvon Ahmed getting all the work. So against this defense that is this bad against running backs, obviously Myles Gaskin in line for a great game, but Salvon Ahmed himself has some nice sneaky flex appeal in what should be the matchup of the week. All right, next is Alex Collins. It's easy to forget about him because he hasn't really done much recently. Only 10 carries last week, but game script was completely against him. The only other running back who touched the ball on the ground last week was Travis Homer, and he only had 1 carry. So Alex Collins is still the lead back here. And Pete Carroll said earlier this week that Chris Carson just hasn't made the progress they had hoped for. So it sounds extremely likely that Chris Carson will be out again. And going up against Arizona, yes, they're a good defense, but you got to think the Seahawks and Russell Wilson will be much better. This offensive performance should be much better for the team, which should give Alex Collins chances not only to carry the ball more, but potentially score a touchdown. So Alex Collins, another guy with great flex appeal, maybe even low-end RB2 value in this matchup, who's kind of been forgotten that you can use as a sneaky start. And then finally, a guy who was kind of a darling in the preseason, Ty Johnson, as a late-round running back stash, then kind of left for dead. It's easy to overlook the fact that he's had 11 or more PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games. And in the 5th game, he's still got you almost 9 PPR points. He's been doing it on the back of a ton of pass catches. Not quite to the level of Michael Carter, of course, but him and Michael Carter are the primary pass-catching backs in this offense, not Tevin Coleman. And even with Joe Flacco being named the starter here in Week 11, I think that's still okay for both of these running backs. Joe Flacco has no problem checking it down or dumping it off, especially at this point in his career. So Ty Johnson still has plenty of flex appeal in this matchup, especially in PPR leagues, and he's got the juice and the burst to always hit a play and make something happen, and he can always score a touchdown. Not to mention they're going up against Miami, who I know has been better on defense the last 2 weeks, but I'm not completely sold that this is an elite defense. I think Ty Johnson will have chances in Week 11. All right, moving on to wide receiver. How about Kenny Golladay? I guess at this point he's a sneaky start because he's been completely forgotten. Only had 2 catches in the game before the bye, but he was coming off an injury. Didn't play his normal amount of snaps. You got to think, coming out of the bye, he's going to play more snaps now, and the matchup is really good against Tampa Bay. Not a secondary to be afraid of, not to mention Richard Sherman has been placed on the COVID reserve list with that injury, that calf injury, so he's expected to miss at least 3 weeks. So this secondary is really banged up, and Kenny Golladay is still the big play guy here. Even with Golladay out, we didn't really see anything from Darius Slayton. We didn't see anything from Kadarius Toney. I think Kenny Golladay can lead this team in targets this week, and he's a guy who may have been dropped in some of your shallower 10-team leagues. So if he's out there and you're desperate, take a look at Kenny Golladay. He's got a great matchup in Week 11. Next up, Michael Gallup. We finally saw Michael Gallup last week after being out since Week 1, and he looked great, right? He had 3 catches for 42 yards on 5 targets, which is what you got to expect first game back. The fact that he was targeted 5 times is a great sign because you got to think he's going to build on that here in his next healthy game. And going up against KC, again, another defense that looked better in Week 10, but I'm not sold that they are some elite defensive unit. This is still a bad defense, and even though Derek Carr and the Raiders couldn't take advantage of them, Dak Prescott and the Cowboys will, and we know Michael Gallup is a big play waiting to happen. So expect Michael Gallup to get more targets, more yards, and maybe even a touchdown in this one. Again, another great sneaky start at the wide receiver position. And then finally, talk about remember him. How about Robbie Anderson? Where have you been, Robbie Anderson? Well, maybe all it took was Cam Newton to revive Robbie Anderson's fantasy value, because in just 4 Cam Newton pass attempts, Robbie Anderson had his best fantasy day of the entire season. That's right, and he scored a touchdown. So with a whole Cam Newton for an entire game, maybe that's what it will take for Robbie Anderson to finally become fantasy relevant in 2021. And going up against Washington, I talked about that Tampa Bay secondary. That Washington secondary is even worse. And despite the defense being slightly better, the secondary hasn't gotten any better. Not to mention Chase Young now out for the season, unfortunately, with a torn ACL. So that pass rush won't be as good either. So this is a great spot for Carolina for this passing game. And hopefully Cam Newton is what Robbie Anderson needed to salvage his season. He's probably a guy who is on waivers in pretty much every league. So if you're desperate, grab him and put him in your lineup. And then finally, let's end with 1 QB and 1 tight end. And my QB pick is Justin Fields. Didn't really do great for most of his starts, but over the last 2 games, he's been a top 10 fantasy QB, and most of that is with his legs. And you know how much I love those running quarterbacks, right? Because they give you such a nice, safe floor and massive upside. Over the last 2 games, he has 103 and 45 rushing yards plus a rushing touchdown. Not to mention he's actually looked more comfortable throwing the ball, which is a good thing. Going up against Baltimore, normally that's a defense you want to avoid, but they haven't been that good defensively this year, to be honest. I think he's going to have plenty of chances in this one, and if he continues to use those legs, he has a nice high floor, and not to mention a nice ceiling in this game as well. And then I've got Justin Fields. Why not go with his tight end? Cole Kmet has 6, 6, and 8 targets over his last 3 games. And in the game before the bye, he actually led the team in targets in that game. So that's what you want to see. And as the season has gone on, he's gotten more and more comfortable in this offense. And that connection with Justin Fields is growing and growing. And despite Mike Gesicki putting up a goose egg against Baltimore in Week 10, this is still a very tight end friendly defense. One of the worst defenses against tight ends. In fact, before that game against Mike Gesicki, they were the worst defense against tight ends. I'm not buying into their suddenly some magical tight end defense. That was just a crazy game. Cole Kmet, if he sees 6, 7, 8 targets in this game, he should have a very nice game. Always a chance to score, especially in PPR leagues. So look at Cole Kmet as a sneaky tight end start if you're desperate at the position, and aren't we all? All right, guys, that does it for my sneaky starts for Week 11. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.